Hey everyone, it's Peter Kerr from Rock Daydream Nation. I have got a special guest, Aussie rock legend, royalty, Angry Anderson. How are you, mate?
I'm good, thank you. I really, really, I'm flattered by I get that rock royalty thing. It's like the legend thing. It's like the icon thing. Fucking blah blah blah. But because I mean, most of us are very uncomfortable. When I say most of us, just in general conversation with other performers, most of us are a little uncomfortable with it, because it's kind of like, but it's very flattering in another sense. But I must say that I've run across a couple that refer to themselves as such, yeah, but just because, I mean, let's face it, in the industry, there's some people who take their notoriety very, very, a little too seriously, I think, like, it's like the old saying, remember, don't, one of the rules of success and all handling it or accommodating it, dealing with it basically is don't ever, don't fall into the trap of believing your own publicity.
Vanda and Young, what were they like in the studio? Were they sort of laid back or were they very interventionist? They, sort of worked very closely with the arrangements and the sound, or did they just sort of sit back?
I remember saying in an interview once, some years ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, whatever, um, and I was asked a similar question, or it was similar in its intent. And I said, I remember saying to George once after he'd had a confrontation or a disagreement with Peter, and they agreed to disagree, and he left. Pete left, and I was staying back to do vocals, and I said to George, "You could have been a politician or a diplomat." And he sort of sat back because he had this thing about sitting back in the chair, right, with his hands behind his head, and they both did, which was funny because they sort of, there's Harry, this tall, blonde sort of Dutchman, and George was about my size, diminutive person, like struggle to make 5'2". And Harry's like 6 foot, sort of, and yeah, I remember he just laughed and he goes, "What do you? Why do you say that, Angry? I can't do the accent." And I said, "Because you're so diplomatic." I said, "I love the way." And in retrospect, in hindsight, whatever, I think back on those times, and I think the way that he manipulated, the way that he cajoled or caressed, and got us to do, or for anyone for that matter, but particularly us, because we were fairly unruly in the studio. And the way that he got us to do things, was magic. And Harry had this completely. Harry always sat at the back of the room on the couch, and he'd always have a guitar in his hand if he wasn't sitting back like this, and the guitar in his hand was most of the time, and he would be just working out parts, and while you're in doing something, he would say something. I'd be in the room, in the control room, the band would be in trying to get a track, and Harry would lean forward and he'd say, George, maybe we should try this, And as soon as the band came back in, George had worked that into the conversation about what Harry had said about, maybe this is a better passing chord, or, whatever. And they worked seamlessly as this amazing team. They were like one person, not like the dual personality, which is rather scary. But yeah, it's like late at night. George would say, "Well, you stay behind, mate, and we'll work out the vocal." And we'd go and sit at the piano, and he'd play and he'd say, "What dun 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 dun? Can you do that one?" I can't do the accent, but I go, yeah, I can sing that song. He goes, "Well, try that," and you'd hear the track back the next day with that change of one or two notes, and you think, "Fuck, that's clever." In fact, that's so, it just gave it that extra depth, if you like, or something. But it added. It's like flavouring a stew. A bit more of that. No, needs more of that. You know what I mean? And it was just the magical experience. They were just so switched on. They just knew their craft so well. And I remember talking to George about it years later. Well, even at the time, but particularly some years later, towards the end of our association or relationship with Alberts. And I said, there's nothing like, we were talking about experience. And I said to him, because all their decisions, like anybody really, when you think about it, is based on past experience. They learnt. They were very aware. They were very, they drank in all the experience, good and bad, or plus and minus, or positive and negative, about the industry. So they knew about publishing, they knew about management, they knew about it because they'd learnt from being burnt and robbed and, sold secondhand just to steal some of Bond's lyrics, which I think he may have gleaned from conversations with George, actually, because when I hear those lyrics, I think that I can hear George talking. I can hear, it's like when you listen to their particularly their early albums, before George and Harry handed over to other producers. You listen to those albums, and there's George and Harry all over them. And the same with the Angels, and the same with Choir Boys, the same with anyone. Ted Mowry, even. I mean, because they wrote with Ted because he was such a prolific and good writer, good quality writer. They got involved with him and wrote, and they had they tapped into genius, or they were able to channel inspirational genius into practicality, and that's why they were so successful.
So they sort of morphed into the personality of Bon and gave him suggestions. I've never heard that. I've often, I've seen you live plenty of times, and sometimes you've spoken about Bon as a true street poet. And I love that expression, street poetry, because a lot of your songs, like the early album, to me, it's just street poetry.
Do you know the story behind that?
Please share it.
Oh, well, you finish what you're going to say.
Yeah, I was just thinking how much of Vanda Young probably added that sort of sprinkle dust to Bon and his lyrics and his street poetry. To
sprinkle dust, you mean fairy dust, don't we?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Yes. I think so. I think one of the, let me say this first, where there was talent, raw, unrefined talent, George and Harry were magical with the fairy dust, but with their guidance and with their advice, how to get the best out of this raw material, right? So let's establish that first. You have to have the raw material first. So, yes, they may have influenced myself and Bon and any of the others that worked with them. But I remember, anyway, the street poet conversation comes from, we were at the Mansell Room, and I walked in late after a gig and went straight to the bar with my then minder. And anyway, I hear this voice behind me, and it went something like, hey, can you get out of the fucking way? Like, I want to get to the bar. So I've just got to the bar, right? So I've turned around and it was Bond. I said, as I was turning around, I was sort of like, how about fuck off, you know? And anyway, we got drinking and we got talking, and we were both come from a gig, so we were both pretty sort of liquored up anyway. But, you know, the Manza was the last stop before daylight. And we're standing at the, there's two things that came out of this conversation, which I need to relate. So we're there talking about, Bon, by the way, is the only singer that we ever invited to come and sing with the band. And it stemmed from Angus and or Malcolm, predominantly Angus, would turn up at our gigs and want to get up and have a jam. Malcolm did a couple of times, but his rhythm style was so different from Mick's that they never quite married as a rhythm, as two rhythm. So it was either one or the other, which is fine. You know, a couple of times it did happen. But anyway, getting back to Bond. So we're having a few drinks and we're waxing lyrical, pissing in one another's pockets, I think is the more at the bar terminology about, and we were patting one another on the back in a sense and sort of saying, you know, we're the last of the, or, you know, we are, you know, like the street poets. And because we wrote songs about, he wrote more songs about girls than I ever did, but he wrote about it in such a way that it was not misogynistic. I mean, that's what they probably describe it as today, but the apologists. But he wrote about the experience with women, not so much as the broken-hearted romance, but the raw sexuality of chicks on the road relating to bands, to rock and roll bands. So the same about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, right? The most well-worn phrase, one of the most well-worn phrases in the English-speaking language. Whereas I wrote mainly from a male's point of view about what it's like being a male and relating sort of maleness, if you like. So anyway, towards the end of the conversation, he turns around and he goes, Alex Harvey is the greatest rock street poet. And I went, Alex Harvey. I heard the name and I thought, Alex Harvey, right? And he sort of, fucking Alex Harvey. And I went, yeah, no, yeah. So he's wearing a denim cutoff. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a cassette. No case, just a cassette. And says, here, take that home and fucking play that. Tell me what you think. And I put it in my vest pocket, in my denim pocket. And that's it. We got, you know, fucking mangled and shit-faced and we went our separate ways. And then, so the next day I got up and I put it in a cassette player and bang, my life changed. So the next time I ran into him, which was a couple of nights later, I said, that is just the most fucking amazing singer that I've heard. And years later, I don't know to this day whether Bon actually got to meet Alex. I think he would have put himself to task to bring about that meeting. But I had the amazing experience of going to see Alex Harvey do one of his last gigs at the Marquee in London when we were living there, and got to talk to him and saw him perform, which was fucking extraordinary. It wasn't the sensational Alex Harvey band; it was just the Alex Harvey band by that stage. So different lineup, you know, but extraordinary experience. But just to talk to him, and he such a little fella, you know. Reminded me a lot of the Youngs, as it turns out, you know, because, you know, small stature but fucking enormous in presence. But yeah, that's how that street poet conversation came about. Was that we were complimentary to one another about one another, and we were very quite serious. I mean, even though it was a drunken rave,
yeah,
we were very serious about what we were saying, that we considered ourselves to be, whether that was a bit bombastic or not, I don't care. That's I've reached that age where I don't give a fuck. But yeah, we were sort of acknowledging one another's effort to try and we talked about other great street poets, Bob Dylan, obviously, Woody Guthrie, the kind of people who tried to document life as they lived it in their songs.